Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Jo Tyndall, who holds the Environment Directorate at the OECD, where she oversees its program covering issues from climate change and biodiversity to eco-innovation and green growth. Jo Tyndall previously served as New Zealand's climate change ambassador, ambassador to Singapore, and also co-chaired the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. Other senior positions included Chief Executive of New Zealand's public broadcasting funding body and Chief Executive of two screen industry organisations. Jo Tyndall, welcome to C2GTalk. So perhaps you could start by telling us about your work at the OECD. You've been there since mid-September last year, I believe. Can you give us an overview of the programs you oversee, what the priorities are over the coming months?
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me on this C2GTalk. And yes, that's right. I joined the OECD in mid-September last year, so I'm still just able to claim ignorance for another probably couple of months before I'm no longer new. One of the things I've noticed most particularly since starting this role is how very much climate change and other environmental issues are increasingly being mainstreamed across the OECD work. That's reflected in two major initiatives that are pretty new for the organisation, one called Net Zero Plus, and the other the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, or IFCMA. So I can talk very quickly about both of those. The Net Zero Plus project aims to ensure that our resilience to climate change impacts, and more importantly, the resilience of the transition to net zero itself, aren't thrown off course by the kind of rolling crises that seem to be afflicting the world at the moment. And that project is underpinned by up-to-date, comprehensive data and indicators across all forms of climate action. The IFCMA, the Inclusive Forum, was just launched in June last year, and it's about to meet in early February. So its aim is to take stock of the full spectrum of climate mitigation policies and to develop tools to assess their effectiveness in reducing emissions. We know that in joining the Paris Agreement, countries took a vast diversity of approaches to how they were going to meet their mitigation targets. More generally, though, in the Environment Directorate, we help not only OECD members, but also non-member countries to design and implement effective policies to address environmental challenges and sustainably manage resources. I've talked about climate policy, supporting net zero targets and climate resilience. Another a big area is biodiversity, where of course there was a conference, a ministerial conference at the end of last year in Montreal. And we provide evidence-based analysis and data to support governments and will be supporting governments to implement the post-2020 global framework on biodiversity. We work on plastics as well, particularly as there is a new global treaty on plastics in negotiation, and a kind of interesting area that tends to become rather technical very quickly is chemicals. And while I read papers that make little sense to me, when you drill down to what they actually mean, they impact on every single human being's life and animal life every day. So it's really important work.
You mentioned oh, sorry.
No, all I was going to say was that on climate change, the other area where we're really focusing on is resource mobilization. Making sure that finance and investment from all sources, public, private, international organizations, whatever, is redirected to meeting the climate challenge. Because what we know is that if we're going to have any chance of reaching the Paris Agreement goals, we can't make change that is linear or incremental. It's got to be absolutely transformational and treated as the crisis, the urgency that it deserves.
I wanted to pick up on your phrase earlier, the rolling crises, or I think in the Davos recently, the phrase of the day was polycrisis.
Yeah.
There's certainly a sense of a lot of stuff is coming along at once. How would you kind of describe this moment? How does it affect the ability of countries to work together, especially on climate change issues?
Yeah, it's pretty evident, I think, that these polycrises or permacrises or whatever other form of crisis you want to call them are having some immediate impact or risks to tackling environmental degradation and climate change. Because, of course, governments, countries are facing significant trade-offs between policy priorities. And we only have to see that in a number of countries, the energy crisis is slowing progress towards climate goals, at least for now, with reopening of coal plants in a number of countries, for example. So the question is, does that mean that climate change is kind of dropping down the agenda, or is it now being embedded in policy planning? And I think that I take heart from the fact that even though there are these short-term risks and seemingly backward steps, crises also spur innovation and new ways of thinking. And the International Energy Agency recently put out an energy technology perspectives report that notes that the main driver for renewable energy deployment has become energy security rather than climate considerations. Well, okay, if the motivation has changed, that's fine. But so long as the result is to accelerate innovation and deployment of renewable energy technologies, then that's all to the good.
You mentioned risks. The OECD recently released a report on climate tipping points, exploring how overshooting 1.5 degrees global warming could lead to irreversible changes to the climate system. And it also offers some policy insights for effective action. I'd like to dig into some various aspects of this report, but let's just begin with the basics if we can. First of all, what is a climate tipping point? It sounds terrifying. And what are some of the major risks in particular we should be concerned about, with what kind of impacts?
Well, yes, could be terrifying because tipping points are the points of no return, beyond which the Earth systems reorganize, and they can often do so abruptly and irreversibly. The full impacts might not happen overnight, but once the ball starts rolling, it can't be stopped. That's what a tipping point means. And what happens with Greenland and Antarctica ice sheets, Amazon rainforest, essential ocean currents are some of the potential tipping points we've looked into in this report. If they're crossed, the impacts could be indeed disastrous. And it's not just a case of what we're already seeing at a regional level with droughts, wildfires, floods, everything kind of increasing in severity and frequency. It's kind of that on steroids. At a global scale too, tipping points are not isolated systems. And if you tip one element, it can have a kind of cascading effect, tipping other elements. So you start right up in the Arctic Circle and end up through the ocean currents right down in Antarctica, a truly vicious circle.
In fact, one of the phrases in the report that was particularly chilling said that the impacts of these tipping points could cascade this is quoting, through socioeconomic and ecological systems over time frames that are short enough to defy the ability and capacity of human societies to adapt. What does that mean?
Well, pretty much what it says, I guess, that the changes would have too big an impact on our socioeconomic, our ecological systems to allow humans to adapt, or indeed animal life to adapt, and would wreak quite immense negative consequences on human and natural systems. So one example, I'm talking about the potential collapse of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, the melting of permafrost grounds in the Antarctic. Scientists now say these are considered likely, even within the temperature guardrails of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree goal. So if that happened, it could cause several additional meters of irreversible sea level rise. And we've been talking about rises in the parts of a centimetre, so several additional meters is pretty massive. We know that the greater part of the world's population lives in cities, and a lot of these cities are in coastal areas. So the effect on heavily populated areas would be considerable, as well as resulting in a feedback loop with additional greenhouse gas releases, leading to yet more warming and pushing us closer to more of those tipping points. The other thing that has to be taken into account, and hasn't been so far, is the economic costs. Those for a long time have been really underestimated because economic modelling has left tipping points out of their projections. And now we're seeing studies that show that tipping points could increase the costs of climate change by up to a factor of 8. And we already know we're talking about trillions in terms of costs.
So how should policymakers react to this information? I mean, the report obviously asserts it's vital to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C with no or very limited overshoot. And yet, the science suggests it's more likely than not that this limit will be passed for maybe over the next coming years, and that currently no plausible path exists to limit warming to 1.5. Yeah. And also when we see the results of recent UN climate summits, while there was some progress on some issues, didn't fundamentally give much hope that humanity is ready to cut emissions at the pace or scale needed. So, where does this leave policymakers? First of all, how could they do more to go about actually limiting, maybe if not altogether, the extent and duration of an overshoot of 1.5? And also, how should they be preparing now, essentially, for these risks brought about by the overshoot and potential tipping points?
Well, I think we've sort of kind of lived in a false feeling of security, thinking that tipping points might be there, but they're a long way in the distant future. So the first thing for policymakers to understand is this is today's problem, not tomorrow's. Of course, it makes sense then, because it is today's problem, to add to the imperative to take collective, ambitious and bold action to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions before the end of this decade. We know that's the very limited time frame within which we've got to act. It's less than 7 years, and really ramp up efforts to keep average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, not being satisfied with 2, and try to limit any overshoot throughout the century. Bear in mind, though, that just below 2 degrees world, in line with the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that have been put forward, would still mean a world that is considerably less habitable than one at 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, at the same time, let's do something sort of a little bit more optimistic, because just as you can have negative tipping points, equally, it's important, I think, to identify and create conditions to trigger positive tipping points. So the inflection points in social, economic, or technological trends that would lead to a sudden acceleration in systems change and a downward trend in emissions. We're already starting to see that start to happen in some areas, agriculture, ecosystem regeneration, and equally in politics and public opinion, where things have changed over the years.
I definitely noticed this framing actually recently of the positive tipping point. We're now at a positive tipping point of electrification of vehicles or renewables, yes, or whatever it may be. Is this a deliberate effort by people like you to try and get this framing out there, to try and help people think differently about this challenge?
Yes, well, yes, I think that's where we want to go next. Right. I don't think it's particularly helpful to the world, and it's not been helpful in the past to have a narrative that is driven entirely by doom, despair, and just painting this awful picture of an uninhabitable world where there's almost a sense that there's nothing that can be done about it. Positive tipping points is an area of work we want to build on very much in the next phase of our work. And we really need some background work to understand the levers and the opportunities for setting them in motion. So that's definitely on the horizon for the OECD.
Yeah, I'll definitely keep an eye on that. One thing the report notes, well, it says technological development, innovation are going to be pretty crucial in all of this. One approach it cites is carbon dioxide removal, which it says would need to play a role in limiting warming to 1.5 with no or very limited overshoot. Obviously, the focus has been primarily on not emitting in the first place, but we've seen growing attention paid to carbon removal over the past year, increasingly by the private sector, entrepreneurs, investors, first to deal with, hard to abate emissions, but also in some cases to talk about rolling back, essentially cleaning up the atmosphere. At the same time, there are concerns that, we might all be seeing too much potential for this. There could be costs and trade-offs. I'd be very interested in your thoughts of how you see the sort of emerging carbon removal sector, what kind of opportunities and challenges there are around this group of technologies.
Well, you're right. It is a combination of opportunities and challenges. And I think it's interesting that the IPCC has made it pretty clear that carbon dioxide removal in one form or another is going to have to play a key role in if we're to keep the global warming to within that 1.5 degree limit, or indeed keep the overshoot very limited. In particular, when it comes to counterbalancing the really hard to abate sectors of the economy with residual emissions. But we shouldn't underestimate the challenges around, use an acronym, CDR. These technologies, there are legitimate concerns regarding bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's legitimate concerns around the need for significant land use and the impacts that could have on biodiversity, natural ecosystems, and of course, food production itself. Because we don't want to, to take away land from the production of food with a growing global population. There's also, I think, a great deal of work to be done before we're able to scale up technologies like direct air capture. And at the moment, doing that seems to use up too much energy, or more energy than it's kind of saving. So we need to much better understand the potential trade-offs between the risks of using CDR and the risks of crossing climate tipping points if those technologies weren't employed. And that means investing in better understanding the trade-offs and doing a better job of risk assessment.
And I guess in each case, it's not just that one particular approach of technology does this. You could do it in a good way or a bad way. And there is this sort of idea of high integrity versus low integrity, and linked to all sorts of issues such as how permanent is the removal and what kind of monitoring and so forth. What kind of policy tools do you think we're going to need over the coming months or years to encourage this sort of high integrity, I guess, carbon removal? And what kind of role might the OECD play in encouraging that?
Well, I guess that gets to the point about one of the OECD's main areas of comparative advantage, and that is in the ability it has and the reputation it has for providing policy advice and for using the work it does to help the development of best practice. So first thing I think I would note is that policy around this area needs to attract and support long-term investment. So it needs to provide certainty or stability, and that in turn can encourage investment and innovation. It also assumes good sustainability, governance, public engagement and transparency, of course. So that's, I think, a first point. It also is going to be crucial to communicate to policymakers that to avoid overshoots, the technologies have to be applied in addition to fast emissions reduction. It's not an either or. The IPCC has made it clear that we've reached a point where both are going to be needed. CDR technologies aren't going to deliver the mitigation necessary to save the world, but nor can mitigation alone lead to safe levels of emissions.
And this is definitely a concern that critics of this sort of trend have brought up. The idea of moral hazard, that by giving the sense that you could remove CO2 from the atmosphere, you might lessen the impetus to not put it in there in the first place. So you made it clear it's about informing policymakers. Are you actually starting to think about policy tools to ensure that one doesn't detract from the other, that are there things we can do to avoid this moral hazard beyond information?
I think that's ongoing work. I don't know if we've come up with full answers to that yet, but as I said earlier, we're working very much breaking down silos within the OECD organization itself, and we have a directorate that deals with scientific technology or science, technology, and innovation, and that is one that is looking very closely at these kinds of technologies and what might need to happen. We've talked about carbon dioxide removal technologies, which are a little bit more established or have been around for a longer period of time, but there are, of course, others around solar radiation modifications, that are even less kind of tested or understood. And I think in both of these areas, we haven't really tackled yet, and I don't know if it's the OECD's place to do so itself, but it could certainly help. We haven't tackled yet the lack of any kind of national or international governance around them, and I think that's going to be really important as well. So we've got to understand better the risks and trade-offs that have to be made. So often with new technologies, we start off with the good side. It's the best thing since sliced bread. It's going to change the world, and all the rest of it. And then the bad side becomes apparent, and if you look at social media or things like that, it's obvious as an example of something that we couldn't live without, but has some really big downside risks that weren't thought about at the beginning.
So I'd love to pick up on this. You mentioned solar radiation modification technologies, and these are the idea of course, of reflecting some more sunlight into space to reduce the temperature, including a really controversial idea to spray the stratosphere with aerosols. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. And the report, the Tipping Point report, said that these approaches are today not a feasible option for reducing the risk of crossing tipping points. But do you think there is a potential that they could be in the future? You talked about assessing the risks and benefits. Do you think, would you support more research into understanding SRM at the moment as something that we might potentially turn to later?
Well, I think the very fact that geoengineering techniques are on the radar is perhaps a bit of an indictment of decades of failed efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, as you said, our report suggested that SRM technologies are not really a feasible option, certainly at the moment. That's partly because the level of research to date is pretty limited. There's low confidence in their effectiveness and considerable risks associated with them. So, and as I said earlier, in terms of either national or international governance, it's pretty non-existent. So the whole area, I think, has to be approached with real caution. Well, that said, of course, because the notion is around, the things like aerosol technologies are being talked about, of course, more research needs to be done. We can't just pretend they're not there. So if they're around, we really have to give some thought to what that means and what the trade-offs might be. I still think we've got limited resources, so the first priority has to be making sure that we're investing in the technologies that can deliver 1.5 degrees through greenhouse gas mitigation. And these sort of remedies are well, they're kind of dealing with the symptoms rather than the cure. It's like taking aspirin for a headache. They might be providing relief while they're being deployed, but as soon as you stop deploying them, you might see a rebound of the problem, or an even worsening of the problem. Some of the technologies or ideas that are in place are frankly potentially a little bit scary. So yes, they need to be better understood, and that does mean more research.
And they are scary. And so is, of course, climate change. And so this is where it gets really tricky. How do you measure scary against scary? How do you give a value to the different levels, which one's scarier? And, this is the whole kind of challenge, I guess, of how you actually go about measuring the risk of doing something and against the risk of not doing something. It's some of these sort of profoundly difficult things. Have you, in terms of actually framing things like that, risk versus risk, have you got any insights into how you can help policymakers actually go about balancing these two different sets of risks?
Well, I don't know about these specific sets of risks, but what we are doing increasingly, and I referred a little bit earlier to this Net Zero Plus project. And what we're trying to do there is not only mainstreaming climate change, into our own thinking, but also into government thinking. We're also trying to use strategic foresight and systems thinking approaches to help the design and implementation of policy. So they're trying to look at trade-offs, at risks, at the implications of using levers in one sector of the economy and what that might result in other areas. Another point I think we are increasingly trying to build in is looking at the connections, for example, between climate change and biodiversity. The two have kind of been treated as somewhat separate. But if we're looking at solutions for climate change, we've got to also factor in the potential risks or trade-offs for biodiversity. If you plant lots of trees, but it's a single type of tree, you're going to create a biodiversity problem potentially in trying to resolve a climate one. So systems thinking approaches, I think, is one area that we are going to be building on quite significantly to try and help policymakers and governments understand the huge complexities and the huge trade-offs that have to be made.
I just wanted to pick up one point before finishing on the solar radiation modification point. But you mentioned governance a few times. Do you have a sense of what international fora you think would be most appropriate for the governance of this idea?
I don't know if I've got an answer off the top of my head, but I think clearly it needs to be done, and whether it's a UN issue is one. The UN is obviously the largest in terms of membership. I'm not suggesting the OECD, because it's not a kind of treaty making or negotiating forum. It's also got more limited membership, so we're not the place. We can help support, but if it happens anywhere, it's probably under some part of the UN system. And we could help with transdisciplinary research that I think could create the conditions that would, or at least create the context within which some international work on governance arrangements could be helpful. And could
just going back to your systems thinking point, I wanted just to draw briefly on your history in public broadcasting, or with public broadcasting. Do you think what more can the media do to help people think in this way, to actually compare systematically, this is this world, this is that world, here are the different risks, this is which way we might to go? It's a very broad question, obviously, but we're in a pretty fast shifting information environment where people are increasingly finding it difficult to distinguish reality from misinformation, the infodemic, and so forth. Do we need a new kind of media, or to reform existing public media, or something to help people better get a grasp, the general public better get a grasp of these sort of difficult decisions, so that they can also play a meaningful part in future governance of climate technologies and so forth?
It's a really big question, Mark.
I'm not necessarily expecting an answer. I just kind of wanted to throw it out there. Had you had any thoughts in that general area?
Yeah, and unfortunately, as I said, we've seen the downsides of social media, very much so, in recent years, and that you've got these sort of echo chamber implications with people just talking with like-minded and reinforcing their own views, whether they're climate skeptics, deniers, or people for whom it is a daily passion. Media does and must have a pivotal role in ensuring that there is better understanding of the risks and implications of climate change. I think education is critical, and education is increasingly being delivered through media, not just a teacher standing in front of a chalkboard. So I would say that I don't know if I can come up with a solution for a new form of media, but I think it's important to get the balance right in terms of the message. So that the message doesn't sugarcoat the issues, but at the same time, it just doesn't induce despair. I was posted in Singapore, as you mentioned, as New Zealand's ambassador or high commissioner there. While I was there, and okay, it was mainstream media, they produced a series of documentaries, really well done, that brought climate change and other environmental issues to the people, and presented. I mean, it was presented by an MP who could have given up his day job and done this full time, and he did a fantastic job of really illustrating in meaningful ways that people could grasp and apply in their own life. What climate change would mean and why they needed to care about it and what they could do about it.
I'd like to just finish on a slightly more personal note, if that's all right. You interestingly said we need to sort of counter the terrifying narrative of negative tipping points and positive tipping points. Just in the last answer, you talked about balancing despair with what you can do. This is great sometimes on an intellectual level, but deep down emotionally, I don't know, when you read these reports, they can be quite hard to digest. How do you personally keep a sort of sense of motivation or agency or hope when working on such an intractable problem?
Well, yeah, I quite agree. Terribly easy to just want to pull the duvet up over your head and hope it kind of all goes away. But it's an oft-used thing. But I have children. I want my children to be living in a world that is habitable, and drawing on my background as a negotiator around the Paris Agreement. When I started work on climate change, it didn't feature. Environment ministers and ministries, had responsibility for it, but it was off to one side, and it was, just sort of go away and do your stuff. With the Paris Agreement, I think it really set off these ripples in a pond. Okay, it's not a perfect agreement, but it is a global treaty. It sent very strong political signals that governments around the world, 164, were committed to delivering on its long-term objectives. Now, the ripples then led to countries setting targets at a national level. Ripples went further out to developing policies and the instruments that would deliver on those targets. From there, I think it extended out to local government. So you've got cities and provinces or states or whatever also taking action. And again, to the business sector. When they could see the long-term writing on the wall, as it were, it allowed them to start, at least big business, to start making their investment and business decisions that factored climate change action and reducing carbon emissions in. And from there, I think the ripples go on down to a household and individual level, and people starting to think about how they live their lives, how they move around, what they eat, and what energy they use. So it's not fast enough. There's a long way that needs and a long pathway that needs to be done. But I'm a great believer that that we are on a pathway from which there is no return. We can speed up. We can put the foot to the floor in our electric vehicle and accelerate massively to get to where we need to go.
Well, Jo Tyndall, let's hope a few more ripples have emanated from this interview. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking part in C2G Talk.
Pleasure, Mark. Thank you. Enjoyed it.